So good afternoon, and thanks very much for joining us for this latest ZC3 Thought Leadership webinar. We run these right through the year. Do keep an eye on your emails for future versions of these webinars. Today we're focusing in on data protection and what to consider when you're analysing commuting data. So when we work in the world of, or in the field of, the commute, and our focus is on reducing and eliminating ultimately commuting emissions. So we want to achieve zero carbon commuting by 2040. And to deliver changes in commuting behaviour, we must better align available services with employee needs. To achieve this, we have to identify current commuting behaviour, why staff travel in the way they do, what the barriers are to change, and what interventions and incentives can help to overcome these barriers. We also need to understand the art of the possible. What services already exist for staff to commute to site? And this is based on where they work and where they live. And where are the gaps in provision? And which providers can help overcome these shortfalls? So that we can have targeted conversations with employees about modes of travel that are relevant to them. So for example, we only want to talk to people about the potential for cycling if they actually live within a realistic cycling distance. We want to be able to talk to people about the provision of a new bus route who live on that potential new route, about frequency, price, service, and what would encourage them to change from their current mode and take up that service. The most effective and efficient way of understanding this picture is to use employee names, email address, full postcode, and their normal arrival time. None of the above is considered to be sensitive data under GDPR, and yet securing this data from employers often proves to be time-consuming for both parties, often delaying the progression of projects. So what is an appropriate, lawful, and reasonable use of employee data? Ben Seretny is head of DPOs and data protection at the DPO Centre. He has worked there since 2019 and has been head of the DPO service since July 2022, managing the largest team of outsourced DPOs in the country. Prior to that, he was head of data protection services at a law firm based in Norwich during the white heat of GDPR implementation. Over the course of his career, he's worked as a data protection officer for multiple private organisations across the financial, tech, healthcare and pharmaceutical industries, as well as large utility and regulatory bodies, UK and multinational, in the public arena. And he's holder of multiple industry qualifications, including a Fellowship of Information Privacy. Ben will take you through this topic for about the next 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have time, roughly 15 to 20 minutes for questions. Do please pop any questions you have as they arise in your mind into the Q&A section, not the chat. And I will fit as many as I can in at the end. So I'll just hand you over to Ben and enjoy the next 30 minutes presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much there for the very generous introduction, Mark. It's a real pleasure to be speaking to everyone today. As mentioned, my name's Ben Seretny. I head up the DPO service at the DPO Centre. So for those of you who don't know us, and sort of after Mark's lovely introduction, we have one of the largest teams of outsourced data protection professionals available throughout the UK and EU. And the way we work is we primarily assign members of our team to organisations on an outsourced basis. So we provide DPO services either on an ongoing basis, usually between 2 to 8 days a month, or for individual large-scale change projects or consultancy work. And over the previous 5.5, almost 6 now, years, the DPO Centre have worked with over 700 clients globally across almost every industry, as Mark mentioned, across finance, life sciences, tech, third-party utilities, public sector. Now, there is a reason for me stating the large breadth of our industry coverage, not just to please my marketing team, who I'm sure will be watching this, but that's also to hopefully express the benefit of me speaking today, which is the experience of how multiple different types of employers can manage the potential data protection challenges that can arise when they seek to process employee data for items such as commuter analysis. So I'm well aware and understand that considering the range of considerations, especially at the moment, that can be high up on the list of employer priorities, the UK GDPR, surprisingly to me, is not always considered the headline act. However, if we as employers wish to implement changes and sustainability moderations to our work practices, it often involves the processing of employee data, and therefore there's going to be some form of interaction with the UK GDPR. So over the course of this webinar, what I hope to cover in as much of a reasonably accessible way as possible is the key priorities for you to consider when you are looking at a shift in your approach to analysing and managing employee commuter behaviours. So if we just move to a quick overview of what we'll cover during this session, and just as a prelude, understandably, when employers are looking to use employee data for any new purpose, there's often some degree of concern or anxiety regarding how to assess the processing and complete all their obligations correctly. So we won't have time today to get into all of the nitty-gritty of some of the elements I'll touch on during our time. But what I wanted to do is give you an overview of the core responsibilities employers have, and then the main actions that you need to undertake when you're looking to process employee data in this context. Once we've done that, what I want to do is move on to the standard challenges that every controller encounters when they're collecting new personal data, or maybe you're repurposing existing data for a new purpose. And these will include requirements to vet and potentially contractually control third parties acting on your behalf for the processing. Identifying and then also understanding the accompanying obligations of things like the correct lawful basis that you'll need to identify and assign to the processing. And then some of the other key fundamentals that are involved in all processing activities, such as issuing sufficient information to employees, monitoring how you afford and protect their rights under the full gamut of data protection law. So it's also worth pointing out as we come into the overview what we'll be unable to really discuss today, which is a bit of an elephant in the room at the moment, just on the date that this webinar falls on, which is the impact of potential forthcoming legislation changes within the UK, and how this may affect our approach to processing all personal data, including that of employees. Now, the potential legislation that I'm speaking of is the current iteration of the Data Protection Digital Information Bill, known as the DPDI number 2, which is currently making its way through Parliament. I believe it received its second reading yesterday. But it's still to progress through the committee stage, where we'll probably get a better idea of what potential alterations might look like in practice as we deviate away from the UK GDPR. Now, although this legislation has the potential to rewrite a lot of our current data protection framework, which was implemented by the UK GDPR, formerly the GDPR before we left the EU, it's still subject to a great degree of scrutiny and alteration. And that's assuming it completes its passage through the House of Lords, back to the Commons. It's a political hot potato as well. And I think that the title number 2 gives it away, that it's been withdrawn and reissued before. So spending time speculating today, as many of my clients want to do, would probably be fun, but it's also unlikely to be wholly useful to you with the time you have, and equally with your current data processing operations. So we'll stick to the law as it stands today, and then potentially, I guess, we can revisit some of today's content if the new law comes in and requires us to do so in the future, which is an exciting follow-up webinar maybe for Mark to consider. But if we don't get time to talk about it today or in the questions, then I apologise, and that's the reason why. It's probably time better spent to talk about what we know is the law and regulation as it stands. So back to employee commuter data. Now, employers already act as controllers under the UK GDPR. Many of these steps required are already going to be in place, and simply they just need adjustment to incorporate a review of how you're going to handle employee data for commuter analysis purposes. So the takeaway point from today is very much we're unlikely to need to reinvent the wheel, but it's very much a case of understanding which steps align with the practices you already undertake and how you can weave these new processing activities into the existing process rather than upending everything. So what I want to look at, we'll touch on some of the definitions in the moment, but we'll move on to processing personal data in the employment context. When I say personal data, and that's why I've popped a rather boring definition up there of the legislation, in terms of the UK GDPR, we're referring to any information that could be related to an identifiable living individual. As Mark said in his intro, that would include common details such as names and emails. In this context as well, it also includes postcodes and potentially any travel information that you derive from your analysis. So in commuter behavior analysis, we're clearly processing personal data, and you as the employer are very much determining the means and the purpose of this processing. You're doing it for your own benefit to analyze the data. So we act as controllers for the purpose of UK data protection legislation. Now, naturally, it's also a standard process to use employee data in the employment context, as you can imagine, not least of all to service the terms of employment contracts, enable management oversight, performance reviews, payments of staff, etc. I'm pretty sure your staff have an expectation that their data will be used in an employment context. In fact, if your staff didn't have their information used for payroll, for example, I'm sure they'd be fairly upset if they didn't have their salary land at the end of the month. So all of that is pretty much expected, and this is just a deviation, an additional use of employee data in the employment context. What I'd like to do though is just touch on the usage of processes. So I'll pop the cart before the horse for a moment prior to running into the core obligations for you as controllers. And that's just to discuss a question which often arises with some clients, and that's the notion of involving third parties to assist with commuter travel analysis or any other processing. Now, I'm sure you're all aware, as employers, it's a wholly common practice to use external third parties to process certain elements of personal data on your behalf. Very commonly, we outsource services covering things like payroll, IT, pension admin, all examples of an employer as a controller engaging a vendor who will act as a processor. And the simplest definition of a processor is just a third party that acts purely on the instructions of the controller to complete a defined process. Now, when we enlist the assistance of a processor as a controller, it's important to remember we do remain wholly liable for the acts and omissions of these third parties. As such, it's a core obligation for us to conduct adequate due diligence to ensure processors understand their own obligations under the law, and equally importantly, that they are able to facilitate compliance with these and assist us with our compliance. So if we just move to the next slide. Once you're able to conduct your risk assessments, record your outcomes, you should ensure that appropriate data processing terms and contracts are in place, and they should ideally reflect with some detail the processing activities and risks involved. There are some mandatory terms that all processors must agree to prior to handling personal data on behalf of the controller. These are clearly set out in legislation to make it easy for all parties. So as a minimum, make sure that these terms are present, and it's always a good indicator in my experience if you want to judge how sophisticated any potential processors are with their data protection obligations, to ask a few questions about how they would acknowledge and then facilitate each of these mandatory obligations throughout the duration of the processing. If you can open up a dialogue with them and run through what they have in place, that is probably your quickest shortcut to understanding if they know what's upon them when they're undertaking processing of your data. Conversely, one of the core benefits of giving your data to a third party and enlisting a processor to undertake tasks on your behalf is that they should, ideally, have specific and detailed knowledge of the main risks that are inherent to that area of processing. That is very much their wheelhouse. It's what they do. It's what they offer themselves out as a service performance. Therefore, you would expect complementary, specific and detailed approaches to recognizing and then mitigating these risks within their operations. And then, of course, ensuring that a third party has done that helps you in turn comply with your obligations under the UK GDPR. So needless to say, the key to making all of this work effectively is to ensure that you are communicating with processors, understanding how they protect information, and then making sure you've got good pre-contractual discussions and a good assessment of existing policies, procedures, and other controls. That's a really, really important step. First of all, for peace of mind, you are obviously giving data to a third party, but also for you to be able to demonstrate your compliance and your obligations have been fulfilled under the law. Just as some quick tips as well, I think a good starting point is to consider if they are simply paying lip service to data protection, using a few buzzwords and throwing them around, or if they really lean into their responsibilities, and more importantly, if they discuss how they can help you meet your obligations. So they're understanding the obligations upon the controller and how they slot in. That kind of language is normally a good indicator, a good starting point that someone's aware of their obligations. Do they openly discuss how data protection is facilitated on your behalf? Are they really transparent about their practices, their controls? Really importantly, are they willing to engage with you and discuss these on request, or do they just have a sort of standing page at best sometimes on their website and don't really want to correspond or deliver any further detailed information? They're all really good touch points when people ask me, how do I know if a process is legit effectively? You always have to run your own due diligence requirements to make sure you're satisfied, but these tend to be quite good shortcuts to working that out quickly. Once you've run all of this and you've satisfied your due diligence, it's always smart to review the contractual documents again. Make sure that any of those representations that regard their data handling practices, security, how they manage compliance, make sure they're included in the written terms or referenced in the contracts between the parties. And then the responsibilities as well as liabilities, of course, are understood and portioned out appropriately. At that point, you can feel that your vendor control is at a good initial point. And then, of course, make sure you have audit rights and how you're going to action those to ensure that you're monitoring throughout the whole of the processing. So moving on to a more core fundamental for all controllers, and that's lawful basis. Again, that is inherent in any processing activity. Now, we have to identify the appropriate lawful basis that you'll rely upon for the purpose of processing your employee data. To simplify things, if you're brand new to this, I was always told to think of these options as buckets. You have 6 available to you. I was also told that some of my slides weren't very exciting, so I put coloured buckets in, which I think ticks off the exciting slide criteria. And each of those buckets represents one lawful basis. If you cannot fit your processing into one of those buckets, it's highly likely it is unlawful, which would indicate a breach of one of the key principles under the UK GDPR, which is that of lawfulness. Just to address a side question, which is one of consent, tends to come up quite commonly, especially in this context. It's certainly one of the better known lawful basis. I think that's in no small part due to all of the exciting requests we receive from wonderful organizations wishing to market their super goods to us. However, it's not often an appropriate grounds for processing an employment context. I know, however tempting it can be to rely on the simplicity of asking for consent. It's nice and binary, it's yes, no, it's recordable, it's demonstrable. It can be very difficult to substantiate the absence of coercion when any imbalance of power, such as an employer and employee relationship, exists. Any consent that you rely upon as your lawful basis must be, among other things, freely given. Now, although we may often wish to tell our boss to go and jump whenever they make certain requests of us, in practice, we're highly unlikely to use that choice of words when we inevitably comply with their request. Therefore, any such consent is not given freely or perceived to be given freely whenever you're under an employment context, an employment contract. So, assuming that consent is highly, highly unlikely to be the option that we will rely on, among the other remaining options, the most likely option is to rely upon legitimate interests of the controller, which would be us as the employer. And it's providing that these legitimate interests are not overriding the rights and freedoms to our employees who are data subjects. Now, using legitimate interests as a lawful basis is is essentially, to break it down, a balancing act. And the way in which we assess the appropriateness of using legitimate interest is to complete simply a legitimate interest assessment. These are pretty straightforward. They're three-part tests, and they aim to examine in the whole the legitimacy of your purpose. So what are you undertaking the processing for? In this context, of course, it's the desire to collect and analyse commuting information to fulfil your own sustainability interests and sometimes obligations, but also the provision of benefits to those employees who commute to their workplace. So once we've done that, we secondly tend to look at the necessity of the processing. And that's, I guess, essentially we're asking ourselves the question, is there a substantially less intrusive manner of achieving our purpose by using less data, or a potentially less risky method of processing? When we do this, we're looking to inquire, is this the only way we can achieve our outcome, or could we reduce the risk in some way by limiting things like the scope of the data, or how we secure the information, or any other controls that might be available to bring that proportionality balance back? Effectively, that's what we're looking to do, is consider if the process and the purpose is proportional to achieving what we want to do. Finally, when we've got these two set out, we're looking to balance them against potential harms that might befall the individuals, or importantly, of course, if our actions might infringe their rights in any unjustifiable manner. It all sounds quite scary when you distill it very quickly into those quick points, but it's important to note that legitimate interests, especially if you're already employers, you have staff, you're likely to be using legitimate interests to process employee data already. Commonly, it'll be things like CCTV, security, web traffic monitoring, holding emergency contact details on behalf of your staff. You're not likely to be asking all of their contacts for consent. That's an example of the same lawful basis, legitimate interests, used in a different but still highly common employment context. You would simply undertake the same assessment and recording and provision of rights as part of your current compliance activities dictate. So different processing, but very much the same lawful basis, and the corresponding obligations and activities apply. The LIA, should you have not done them before, they don't have to be overly technical at all, providing that you are detailed and candid about the elements that I've just discussed. And in fact, the ICO provide a really good template for you to record and evaluate outcomes. So the material is all there, and the instructions are very simple. And it's just a matter of getting it down there and running those balancing acts properly. So once you've done that, like all other processing, once you've defined it, you would update your record of processing activity. Now, depending on the size of your organization, it might be exempt from requirements to maintain a formal record of processing activity. You may be exempt due to size and such, and still choose to complete a document as part of your compliance framework. So again, the message is it's about weaving this slightly different collection and use of personal data into your standard compliance activities as they already exist. There are other assessments, I think it's probably important to note, that you can utilize when you're considering a new processing activity. But as the processing in this context is highly unlikely to create a high risk to the rights afforded to your data subjects or employees under the law, and we're not utilizing a wholly novel technology to complete the activity, then the threshold for conducting a data protection impact assessment, as defined in the UK GDPR, is highly unlikely to be met. But as per the rest of our discussion, if you already have an existing system in place, then I would continue to utilize it without deviation. The absence of a necessity to run such an assessment doesn't necessarily prevent you leaning on your existing practices to ensure you're satisfied prior to commencing any new processing activity. So if you or your compliance team or your framework you have operate a standard approach to all new processing or all new vendors, which requires completion of a privacy impact assessment or a formal DPIA, You can easily wrap this formal new processing into your operations just as you would any other. Once again, don't necessarily deviate, just add it to the system you have already. So once we've looked at that and we're starting to undertake a new processing activity, we're legally obliged to inform employees of the activity prior to commencing processing. So it's unlikely that we'll rely on consent, as I think we've discussed in some detail. So the standard when relying on legitimate interest is to notify as opposed to seek affirmative permission. But under the law, we must clearly state that we intend to rely upon legitimate interest to process the data. And also equally, we need to state the presence of employees, data subjects, right to object to that processing at any time. It goes without saying it's essential that you consider how you would afford this right if your employees chose to object. So would you need to adapt any established processes? Would there be staff training involved? Do you need to update standard operating procedures or systems if one of your staff members said, I really don't care for you to process this information, and you can withdraw them from that analysis? There are minimum levels of information which you're required to issue. Usually this comes as an update to your existing employee privacy notice, and that would include a description of the personal data you intend to use, the reason for the processing, the presence of any third parties receiving the data as part of the activity, and then the intended retention periods for the data, or if you're not sure of that at present, the criteria that you will use, the method of calculation to determine retention, where exact timeframes are TBC. So those items, along with other details that you'll already be providing in your privacy notices, constitute the minimum data to be provided to employees. However, I would always very much urge a best practice approach, which is to explain as much as possible regarding the use of legitimate interest activities. I think not least of all to ensure very much complete transparency in the processing, which is one of our requirements under the UK GDPR. But also in this context, to try and bring your employees along for the ride, pun intended, and to empower them to understand as best as possible why their data is being used for a supplementary purpose. So in my experience, when we're looking at change management and alterations of processing, it not only reduces any volume of objections, which obviously enhances the power and quality of your data, but also assists you with building trust with regards to employee and employee personal data processing, which is incredibly important. So once you've attended to all of those matters, which you'll be doing anyway regularly with all your other processing activities, ensure you update all of your internal processes relating to things like subject access rights, what's afforded to individuals and how you will access and engage those rights. Potentially it might be breach management procedures if there's new data being utilized or another vendor being engaged. And then, of course, any other policy or procedure where a change to processing activity or third party might alter your standard protocols. So coming on to a summary of our slight whistle-stop tour of considerations in this processing context. I want to restate again, we're not reinventing the wheel. Due to the nature of the data being collected and the purpose of its usage, we're simply looking to undertake new processing activities, potentially involving new data. And as with all other similar activities, we review our primary obligations under the UK GDPR. We ensure we've addressed each principle in turn. By way of illustration as to how standard these adjustments would be, I often try and distill personal data processing change management into the 3 A's, I've called them. This is not an ICO thing. This is my kind of noddy way of trying to explain it to people and really get it down to the bare bones, which is simply assess. So complete all of your reviews, your due diligence, considerations of legality, proportionality, identify your mitigating controls, the things we've talked about. Once you've assessed, you need to advise. So ensure you consult with all your stakeholders and inform your data subjects of the processing, inform them of their corresponding rights, and importantly, how they can engage them. And only when you've done assess and advise, you look to act. Once you're happy with the above points, that's when you start implementation. So if you've kind of thought all of that through and aligned it with your existing processes, it shouldn't be too much of a departure from what you're already doing. So in the context of what we've discussed, to put the 3 A's in a bit more detail, we ensure our adequate lawfulness by correctly assigning and then recording our lawful basis. When we rely on legitimate interest, we've conducted an appropriate legitimate interest assessment, recorded the outcomes, and then we've implemented any mitigations or scope reduction to potentially reduce the risk. Once we've done that, we've transparently notified employees with at least the minimum amount of information required. We do that either as an update to an existing privacy notice, or you can do it as part of the campaign to raise awareness of commuter activity and sustainability. Those two go kind of hand in hand together and fit really nicely. Our purpose and data minimization should really have been addressed in our very candid legitimate interest assessment. And we've verified how we, potentially in partnership with any vendors, will ensure data accuracy and adequate security measures are implemented and maintained throughout the entire duration of the processing. Again, we'll be reviewing our contractual controls, our due diligence, and any auditing we need to take part. Importantly, we've identified at the very beginning how we're going to document each of those measures by way of assessment, record of processing, due diligence, contract policy, and notifications to ensure we can demonstrate ongoing compliance. That's the accountability principle there, the sort of mock 7th principle. And it's also worth considering that staff receive any relevant training to ensure that they're aware of any additional risks or responsibilities that might impact their process and operations in their role, and importantly, how they manage these. Once again, things like awareness and training, that there's something that you can wrap into your existing awareness and education programs that you're either establishing if you're getting going with your privacy framework, or you're already providing as employers and controllers. So hopefully what I've illustrated and kind of hammered home in this short sum up is these obligations, they already exist for processing in any employment context. The data itself shouldn't be sensitive in nature, and therefore addition of commuter data analysis should represent a very manageable adjustment to your existing data protection practices, rather than what I'm sure is quite an unwelcome upheaval to your employer and your entire compliance and compliance framework. So that's the majority of the information. Thank you very much for your time. I hope it was of some assistance. I think we have some time for some questions if anyone has any. Obviously, I'm unable to advise on specifics or give nuanced answers to detailed issues. But if you'd like to contact me or my organisation, we're always happy to help in any way we can once the webinar concludes. So once again, thank you very much for your attention, and I will hand back to Mark.
Ben, thank you very much indeed. A real eye-opener, as it was last time. That was brilliant. Thank you. There are a number of questions you won't be surprised to hear, so I'm just going to run through those. We've got about 20 minutes or so, so we should be fine. So first question, I'll just read through as they came in from Ruth. Please confirm what data we can use for commuter data analysis. I am being told that we can only have the first 4 or 5 digits, which I'm guessing is of the postcode.
That's an interesting one. It goes back to the legitimate interest assessment, I would say there. So that's really relating to, you're always looking for proportionality. We said at that point, you're trying to strip down the data to the absolute minimum of what you would need. Now, I suppose need is the active word in that, Mark, and you would know better than me as to what the necessity is in terms of how specific that postcode information needs to be to achieve the purpose of the project, which is, of course, to get some active, powerful and useful data in the analysis of commuter behaviour. Now,
which is full postcode from our perspective.
Yeah, I suppose there's those odd outliers who are up there in the Isles of Skye or Scilly or something, and you could probably get away with 2 people per postcode, and you could get away with the first 2 or 3 digits or figures of the postcode. But for everyone else, you might need to go down to that greater degree. So there's no real reason, because of course we have to acknowledge we are processing personal data already. It won't just be postcodes, there'll be names attached, there are identifiers. So the addition of the postcode itself, yes, it increases some degree of risk because you're identifying potentially someone's accommodation, their living accommodation. However, again, you would look at, is there a way of reducing that? If you cannot do it to fulfill the task, then it seems to be managed in that proportionality. And again, I would make sure you will cure a lot of these ills with adequate notification to individuals and allowing them to affect their rights. So do your notifications ahead of time as well. Give people the ability to say, no, I'd rather not have that information entered into this system. I don't want to be part of this process. Don't do it after the fact when, of course, there's a grey area there that you're doing it. Is that in the balance of the individual and yourself, or just for your benefit? So once you start to balance that the individual would expect the processing to occur, they understand what's happening and they have a knowledge of how they extract themselves, then I think it makes it a lot more proportionate. And we can use a bit more detailed data, once again, to ensure we fulfill the purpose. So we're just working through that LIA process.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, next one. We are looking at creating a car sharing network internally in the organisation and with local businesses. Anything we should be aware of when it comes to sharing travel data, e.g. postcodes, pickup times, locations, work email addresses?
There's lots of things to be aware of, obviously, but again, you're going to cure a lot of those ills by ensuring that people are just extremely well notified as to what the data being processed is, the purpose for it, and any safeguards you choose to put in there. Again, as an organization like yourself, you're going to have a lot of advice about those safeguards. But fundamentally, if you're ensuring that people are aware of that, then I would start to work with your vendors about any supplementary safeguards. So that's slightly out of the domain of data protection, but it's things if they have, I'm assuming that was alluding to other concerns in terms of sharing information of location, but it is about notifying individuals so they can withdraw from that. I would be highly peeved if somebody shared my home location without my knowledge for no good reason. If I'm entering into a scheme for my benefit with a full understanding of how it has to operate and what data will be shared and with whom, I'm going to, again, that balance is more likely to be met in legitimate interest purposes.
Well, I think with car sharing, it's the individual that puts in the data. It's self-inputted.
So there is an expectation, they know what's being processed, and hopefully, again, they know exactly why and the reasons for why that specific data needs to be captured and why it can't be lesser.
Okay, brilliant. How frequently should we be reviewing policies?
That's a really good question. Whenever I draft policies, I always do the same thing, which is I put in review periods for them, and I always get the same response, which is, oh God, really? And actually, it's an awkward conversation because I tend to put something like this policy will be reviewed no less than every, I think I put 2 years in some of them, and people come back and say, but then it's always the caveat I have underneath is, or at any point where the processing to which it relates changes. So if the profile of the policy, if you let's pick a policy, data protection policy, if the governing guidance or the nature that it is governing, so if the GDPR changes, the DPA, privacy and electronic communications regs, if any of that changes, or the nature of the data it relates to alters materially, then you need to update your policy. Otherwise, you've just got a document that talks about something that isn't necessarily happening in the organization. So the glib answer they might find there is you need to make sure your policy is reviewed they should be owned by someone who is a policy or process owner. So they are reviewed and altered every time there is a change to that processing activity. And then I would have on top of that add, because the best one in the world, I know exciting changes happen when these things slide. Many organizations can't afford someone like me to sit there and watch the law move around them and update policies. If you have someone in compliance who can do that, fantastic. If not, you should at least have a regular review period. My suggestion would be, weird as it sounds, I put the longer review periods into the clients that have a more detailed compliance framework. The reason being, I know it's going to be altered in an ad hoc fashion more likely. So if I put 2 years, it's going to get a spring clean every 2 years, whether it likes it or not. But I also know there's going to be assigned individuals, myself, the InfoSec lead, CISO, legal counsel, who will be monitoring that policy for when things change. So it's more likely to shift. If you don't have those resources at hand, then you need to really squeeze down that time frame to make sure that at minimum those policies are getting opened, brought out of the drawer, and you're monitoring that they actually reflect what they're trying to do, which is what they're governing, how they're controlling usage of information in the organization. There is no golden ticket time frame, but you really wouldn't want it to be much longer than a year unless you've got someone who's monitoring that policy reasonably closely.
Fantastic. They're piling in, Ben, so you're going to be here for a while.
Okay.
Could you expand on audit rights a little bit more?
Yes, I can expand on it greatly. So I suppose that they're probably, I assume they're alluding to processor controls here. So whenever you engage a processor, you have to have certain terms in place between the controller and the processor, usually in a written document and in the contract effectively. Those are set out in, if anyone wants some bedtime reading, go to Article 28 of the UK GDPR, the GDPR, the UK GDPR, depending where you're processing. Now, one of those mandatory obligations is that the processor has to agree to contribute to and provide to audits at the request of the controller. Essentially, it has to be able to demonstrate it's able to, demonstrate it's doing the things that it is saying in those mandatory terms. So there is a minimum that you have to put in there. In terms of expanding on audit rights, I would say two things to that, which is number one, depending on how you want to negotiate between the parties, between the processor and the controller, you can make those audit rights as broad as you like. Normally, it's based on things like the risk of the processing. The more risky the processing, the more detail and the more options you want, the depth of your audit effectively. So you start at a desktop audit. I want demonstrations that you are complying. I want documentation. I might want third-party audits like ISO 27001 or ISO 2770 after the new data protection add-on. You might want their policies. You might want some of their SOPs. That will kind of be your minimum starting point. It's not uncommon at all to say, I would like the right to have inspection audits at my request. And then, of course, between the parties, you'd agree on some of the conditions for that. For myself or a third party to come in and review any of the processing activities that you are undertaking on my behalf. So we have to have a minimum standard of audit, bearing in mind you as a controller are always liable for that processor. My advice to clients is always don't think of a processor as a third party acting, in the shadows somewhere. They should be treated as though they're one of your employees just in a desk at the far side of the office. They're under your control. You're asking them to do a specific act. If that employee did something wildly awful, you're still in trouble for it. You can't just suddenly blame them and say, well, I wasn't checking up on them. I just assumed they'd be fine. So those audit rights are there. Number one, for you to have that mechanism to check they're doing everything they say. But number two, if something did go wrong with that processor, just have a good think about, should we have enacted our audit rights? Should we have at least done a desktop audit if it's not necessarily the most risky processing undertaken? We've asked for this. I see it quite often. We get these intensely detailed audit right clauses, the right to come in every 6 months and check up on what you're doing and really go through with a fine-tooth comb, which you would probably resist if you're a processor to some degree and say it's not necessary, and I'll show you why. Process would work with them. They would say that I will give you a continual or periodic demonstration of my compliance with third-party audit certification, policies, procedures. But if they did have that, I see it quite often in the pharmaceutical world, and then the controller never actually engages it. Now, that doesn't look particularly good if something did go wrong with that process. You've gone to that great detail. You've probably thrashed it out in a contractual negotiation that went on for hours and hours. And then you just went, great, we've got it there, and we never really attended to it. Now, if something went wrong with that processor 2 years down the line, I think it's fair to say that it wouldn't be looked on particularly favorably if you never enacted that audit, you never actually checked in. It's very common when people do their due diligence at the front end. They'll send off their RFIs and everything else, and you'll diligently fill them in. They go, great, tick box, throw it in the bag, off we go. We'll never think of that processor again. And again, I come back to that point. If you had an employee sitting at the far side of your office, you wouldn't check in on them twice, once every 2 years. You wouldn't say, carry on with your work. I assume you're doing it fine. You would have performance reviews, evaluations. You would monitor the quality of their work. So my tip to processors is shortcut that process by making sure what you're doing and how you're doing it is clear and transparent. So there's no reason for anyone to think that you're not doing it properly. So create, documentation to demonstrate what you're doing. Invite good quality practices and third-party audits and certifications to demonstrate that. If I'm a controller, make sure you're reviewing it adequately and periodically, so you are keeping up your responsibilities as well. Hopefully I've kind of covered the level of what they mean, but I appreciate audit rights can go to some degree of depth.
That's brilliant. I think in terms of the next set of questions, if maybe Ben, you can try maybe about a minute for each, just so we can try and squeeze.
Mark, if they just yes, no, that would be great. I can just nod or shake my head, and then we can go through that one. No,
not
okay,
quite that succinct. This was incredibly insightful. I've always thought of consent as being the gold standard, but you are basically saying in an employment context, that's not the case.
No, again, right back to what we talked about. Consent is highly unlikely to be the case because there are certain conditions you have to fulfill for a consent to be valid under data protection law. And one of those is it has to be freely given, the absence of coercion. And as I'm sure your questioner there is aware, it's very, very hard to suggest there is an absence of coercion in an employment relationship. All of us are highly unlikely, unless we're being remunerated for our services, to get up and do what we do for our employers. So it's always assumed that we're doing it because we're under an employment service contract and we're being paid for it. So if your employer commonly asks you to, are you happy with me to give you this data? You would say, well, God, what's the repercussions if I don't? And as a result of that, it's really difficult for us to say that consent was freely given. So it may not be valid, ergo it may not be the correct lawful basis to use. I would urge extreme caution there are some limited circumstances in employment, I won't go into them all now, and in things like recruitment where consent might be the appropriate lawful basis. However, certainly in this instance, commuter analysis, I think it would be unlikely to be the appropriate lawful basis. Legitimate interest fits the bill significantly better.
Brilliant, thank you. Do these regulations apply when the data is anonymous or has been anonymized prior to the analysis?
So, really good question. These regulations, so if we're referring to the UK GDPR, it does not apply to genuinely anonymized information. So that means it has to be past the point of re-identification of a single individual. Now, the important point to kind of touch on there is there's two stages there, which is the initial collection and analysis, which is, I think you said at the beginning, Mark, you are going to need identifiable information for that to occur. So at the point of that initial processing, it's highly, highly unlikely we can create an anonymous scenario where we cannot identify a living individual, or we cross the threshold where we have no concerns that we will identify a living individual. Therefore, that processing is almost certainly under all of the regulations we discussed. Now, if you aggregate that information, you've just got, names, row level data without any identifying marks at all. Yeah, that onward data would be anonymous. It wouldn't be under the GDPR. So there's two steps in terms of the life cycle of that data. But remember, it only becomes anonymous in that second step where we cannot re-identify that information back to the individual. So if it's truly, anonymized, it's wholly aggregated, for example, then yes, to answer your question, that would be outside of the regulation. Everything prior to that in the collection, it sounds like it's highly likely they'll be considered personal data, and therefore it's under the scope of the laws we've talked about today.
Brilliant, thank you. All right, next one from Zach. Thank you very much, Zach, for your question. Is there a legal basis for processing staff data to reduce commute emissions under the Health and Care Act 2022, which requires NHS organisations to comply with Section 1 of the Climate Change Act 2008, referring to UK net zero emissions targets?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually, which is, and we've debated it before, which is the appropriate lawful basis. Now, in that case, I'm assuming Zach is asking, can we rely upon, probably not legal obligation, there's no direct obligation for them to do that, but could we rely on public interest and then cite the Act as our piece of legislation that we're utilising for that lawful basis? The answer is potentially, maybe. If you are under that, like the NHS, if you're obliged to comply with that, and there is a mandate to do so. However, we described legitimate interest today for multiple reasons, not least of all, they would still apply to the NHS as a body. I think it's a good question to delineate at the moment. Whenever I talk to public authorities, they're often concerned that they can't rely on legitimate interest generally, so they scrabble around with some detail to try and find some form of legislation, because they're very used to operating under public interest in performing their public authority duties, in enacting what they do as a public body. That's for lots of reasons. I know we're down to 1 minute per answer, but to kind of clarify that, when the GDPR came in, there was a bit of confusion as to whether public bodies were allowed to rely on legitimate interests. Anything outside of the performance of their authority, their public body purpose, I guess, which is obviously enacted under law, they can utilize legitimate interests. So the NHS or any other body can rely on legitimate interests for the stuff we've talked about today, much in the same way that any private organization could. But it's a really interesting point as to whether that piece of legislation, when you're under its scope as an organization such as the NHS, whether you could lean on that. Maybe it gives you a secondary and more urgent purpose to do so. But I would love to get into it with Zach for a half hour and chat through the details of it. But you can still feel comfortable that you can rely on the standard position, which is legitimate interests for all of the things we've talked about today. Sorry, I really tried to compress that.
No, that's brilliant. Zach, if you want to have another conversation with Ben, just let me know and we can facilitate that. Rachel, would you recommend that transport consultants approach employers to provide all necessary data, conduct a travel survey, rather than the employer administering it themselves, i.e. the consultant will be purely a processor?
So the travel, I suppose it doesn't really matter if they're purely a processor who are acting that way. They're acting on the instruction of the controller. They're still acting under the controller's lawful basis, and they're still acting on behalf of the controller under their instruction. I don't think it necessarily would have a big impact if they're not a joint controller, if I'm understanding the question correctly, in that as long as it doesn't really matter who collects and sifts that data, who approaches them, as long as they're acting under the instruction of the ultimate controller, the employer, it wouldn't be problematic. Again, sorry if I misunderstood that question, but that would be my interpretation.
Thank you. Ian, thank you for your question. This is very informative webinar that deals primarily with an employer processing employee data. How does this transfer to a football club looking to shape transport to and from a stadium on a match day by accessing location data from a club membership database of approximately 50,000 individuals? So it's not Norwich, i.e. not an employer-employee relationship.
Okay. Moving aside from the slight drive towards Norwich, which I feel is just kicking us when we're down right now, Mark. Yeah, that's a really interesting one. So the football club still operates as the controller. We've been using the term employer-employee. What you could potentially say, though, is the option for consent does open up slightly. Now, I wouldn't say that it trumps legitimate interests. You could pretty much follow the same pattern that we've discussed today with a membership club as you have done with an employee-employer scenario. Same principles all apply, same obligations all apply. Really important to note. I assume as a membership organization, you're still going to be monitoring your data processing, you're going to be affording privacy notices, assessments, etc. However, there's less of an assumption of coercion, but obviously if you start implementing the need for affirmative consent, it does get a bit stickier. You don't get as much, effectively you're less likely to get the same level of data as you would have done under a clearly notified, transparent right to opt out for the better usage of that, which is the right to object to legitimate interests. So yes, good question. We said employer-employee, we could use controller and data subject in most scenarios for what we've talked about today. Same rules apply.
Okay, thank you. Right, we're into the last 5 minutes. Dominic, thank you for your question. What happens if an employee says they are not happy with their data being used for commuting analysis?
Yeah, I think we probably covered that, and I possibly didn't make it as clear as I should do, because it's actually a really, really important point. When you look at your legitimate interest assessment, one of the things you should really consider is that question. If somebody wishes to object, first question is, do I have an overriding position? I can say my legitimate interest outweighs yours. Now, that's for you to consider, but I think in the nature of the context, it's highly unlikely, and you would want to enact their right to object for all the reasons we've talked about today. But again, you would make that decision with your DPO and your compliance team. So when you build that LIA and you say, well, what do we do if someone wants to object? You have to make sure you can clearly state, what would your process be? I think I talked about it. Would you need to alter your standard operating procedure? Would you need to look at your processes or potentially some of your systems that you're using? Do they have the functionality to identify that individual and extract them from the processing? When you work with your third-party processors, your vendors who might assist you with this, such as Mobilityways, can they show you how they would do that? If someone objects, they can go into the data and extract them from it. Really important to remember, when someone objects, you are highly unlikely to continue having any lawful basis for the retention and usage of their data. So they might also say, I'd like you to remove my data. In the absence of that right, can you extract their data from that processing database, essentially that source? So they all do need to be thought about when you're going through this situation. Is what am I going to do, and how do I build that into a process to ensure that I can enact that right when it's asked for? So yeah, really, really good question, and hopefully I covered it a bit in the talk, but probably didn't highlight it enough. If you're going to say that you're going to balance people's rights against your interests, then one of those is, am I going to afford them the right to object? Yes, I am. How am I going to do that? How can I show you that's going to happen? And again, there's no harm in telling people exactly what you will do, so they feel really confident that you will do it. Tends to give people a bit more trust and faith in your processing.
Thank you. Christopher, thank you for your question. If you use employee data and supplement with survey data, do you use legitimate interest for part one, or one part, and consent for the other?
Oh, sorry, can you say that again slowly? That was a good one.
Sorry. If you use employee data and supplement with survey data, do you use legitimate interest for one part and consent for the other?
The survey data itself, I suppose I'm unaware as to where that will be sourced from. I guess you can use so I might not be given a perfect answer because I don't know the context of this question, so I apologize. But what I will say as a general is, as long as one lawful and appropriate lawful basis exists for the processing of the data, yes, it might be multiple lawful bases for different data collections and usage. When you combine that data, bearing in mind, if you've collected part of it under consent, just be mindful that you have to explain all of the processing that will occur to it. And if you start to undertake further processing, which is outside of the consent you've collected, that might be mildly problematic, which is why we don't tend to rely on things like consent for this. I don't know, Mark, if you have more details, if I've missed the point on that one. So I wasn't sure what you mean by combination of survey and travel data.
So I think the survey data is probably referring to travel survey data. So
okay,
you'll be pulling in information from staff about how they commute, and then bringing that together with the employee data to understand, I guess, then how people could commute as opposed to how they do.
If you want to utilize consent, I'll go back to that first position in any employment context, whether it's surveys or otherwise, just make sure it's very, very clear that people don't have to contribute. You know, you have to be able to substantiate that people felt there was absolutely no risk to them in not contributing at all to that data collection. And also that you've clearly explained what the data will be used for and how it will be used, especially in this context where there might be a secondary usage of that information. Does that secondary usage align with the information you gave those individuals at the time of collection? That's when consent can start to become a little bit sticky, when you start to transfer into secondary bases, because then the individual might not be aware of it. Doesn't sound wholly problematic in this scenario. Apologies, I didn't have all of the context, but in principle, yes, you can rely on two different lawful bases and merge. However, it might be that even collection of survey data, again, it's legitimate interest. You don't have to complete this. We assume that in completing it, you're keen to give us your information. You always have a right to object, remove that data if you wanted to. It might be the cleanest and simplest way to do it.
Okay, superb. I noticed we're at 3 o'clock. I'm going to do just 2 or 3 more if you're happy, Ben.
Okay, no problem.
I know we'll lose people now because they'll probably have another call, but if we just cover a couple more, then what we'll do, I'll share the rest of the questions with you, Ben. If you're happy to give a response, we could sort of circulate. That would be really helpful.
No problem at all.
Okay, some of what you've said seems to me to directly contradict my internal data governance team. How do I politely challenge my colleagues?
Very good. How do you politely ask them to state? I mean, I'm sure they're all very good. There we go. Deference at the start. Sometimes people come to different positions based on the information available to them. So make sure that they're really clear about the nature of the data being collected. If you're working with a third party processor or a vendor for this purpose, a consultancy or whatever, make sure that they're really clear. They've given your IG team really clear instructions as to what the processing is, how it will be undertaken. And then a polite suggestion, if you wanted to them, is could they just link guidance to their reasoning. If you're outside of information governance, you tend to not want us to go on and on about our reasoning for doing things, because no one wants us to write chapter and verse. If the position that they're stating is contrary to what the industry position is, or someone like myself is saying, and we're always open to challenge, but it might be that you could just say to them, can you just dig out the guidance so I can refute it? Because of course, it also just helps them work it through. Guidance changes, it adapts. It means they go back to their first position of, oh, well, I like consent and I feel it's appropriate, for example. So it really depends on what the nature of their objection is, but a polite way of challenging. I never have a problem with it if someone just says, could you just give me your thought process on this? Worst case scenario, I've missed something. I have to say, Mayor Cop, I'm really sorry. Maybe we could do it this way. But most times it just gives them an opportunity to rethink where their thought process derives from, or reach out to the third party and say, look, do we need all of this data? Can you tell me exactly why? Because it goes back to that proportionality. I do need to have the postcode down to that level of information because it will not work without it. So I cannot strip the data further. If they understand that, they kind of tend to come around a bit better. I hope that helps. Could be a very tricky scenario. Whoever read that question, I have faith in you to go back to them and pitch it in a friendly but constructive manner.
Well, it was anonymous, so they've started well.
Well done then.
Okay, I see people are dropping out. I'll do one more. Thank you, Jane. What if a prize is offered and an email address and name is asked for? Would this mean that the data would fall into GDPR area? I'm assuming this is a travel survey, I think. If this is given freely, does this change anything? I.e., if they don't give this info, they wouldn't be even with the chance of the prize.
Yeah, I'll be honest, this might upset some people. I'm not a huge fan of data for prize scenarios. I don't think too many of my colleagues would disagree. It is a sticky area, probably for all the things we've talked about before, which is if someone wants to contribute to surveys information or any personal data offering, they'll do it because they see the benefits, they understand what the data is being used for. There's no issue with that. There's a nice transparency element. They understand the benefit of what's occurring and they freely give their data. I think when you start to build in incentives, it can be difficult. It can be worked around. I understand that with notification and such, but I'm not a massive fan of it. To go into exactly how whether that's yes or, I mean, I think the question was, does the GDPR, is it engaged? Yes, it is, absolutely. You're collecting personal data, but you need to be really clear about what you're collecting it for, what the lawful basis is and what you're going to use it for. And do they understand that? Is that really clearly explained to them? But yeah, I don't love incentives for that reason, but I'm constantly shot down by commercial departments. So, there is always ways around it, but yes, that's my initial position.
Fantastic. Okay. I think we should probably stop there. Ben, thank you so much. That was brilliant and insightful. I hope it was helpful to all of you watching and listening. Thank you for joining us. As I said earlier, this is part of a whole annual program now of thought leadership webinars under ZC3. So do keep an eye on your emails. We'll be contacting you with details of the next sessions coming up in the future weeks and months. So thank you for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day and take care. Bye-bye for now.
Thanks, everybody.